Committee will come to order. Is there any further discussion on the resolution? Mr. Sherman is recognized.
This is a good resolution. It is bipartisan, and its original co-sponsors include not one, but two Brads. For that reason alone, everyone should vote for it, but it's also fully consistent with the statements of the administration, the policy of the Biden administration. It is not an authorization to use military force, and the War Powers Act remains the law of the land. That being said, let me respond to a few of the more partisan things that have been said. Yes, indeed, two members of the Democratic caucus have said things about the Gaza hospital that I don't think are accurate. But 198 Republicans voted in late September for a CR that would cut aid to Israel by 30%. I don't think that, I'd love to think that one member of Congress is important, especially when I'm shaving and looking at the mirror. But the fact is 198 members is significant. Two members constitutes 0.5% of the House. I think Mike Pence had it right when in the day after the invasion from Gaza said this is what happens when Republican leaders call for a retreat of the United States on the world stage. $6 billion was moved from a well-frozen bank in South Korea to a less frozen bank in Qatar. I would like that money returned to frozen and then returned to the deeper freeze in Seoul. But keep in mind that democracies are very vulnerable when hostages are taken. And while everyone decries the fact that Iran is closer to getting its hands on the $6 billion, I don't think a single elected official said, don't do the deal to bring this person and that person back home from Iran. The vulnerability of democracies to hostage-taking is not only illustrated today by what Hamas is doing, but was illustrated last decade when Gilad Shalit was freed in return for thousands of Hamas terrorists, some of whom, no doubt, are involved in the attacks on Israel today. That being said, under the prior administration, Iran had its hands on many billions of dollars. As to the AUMF, I saw the flaws of the AUMF, but I will point out that in the early stages, it was both very bad and very good. Iran turned over a huge amount of fissile material, and Iran got its hands on a huge amount of money. In the middle years, including this year, and including all the years of the Trump administration, that deal was at its best. It becomes perhaps flawed, particularly flawed, later this decade when the controls come off. So if there was a time to withdraw from the deal, it was next year or the year after, not last year or not 3 or 4 years ago, when it was doing its job and when Iran's nuclear program had less fissile material than at any time in the last 10, 12 years. So we can talk about a lot of things, but let's talk about the resolution that's before us. Let's vote for it. It says what I think we all agree, and that is we must make sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. And there was no time when it is more clear than today when Iran clearly favors, may have planned, certainly financed, the brutal murder of as many Israeli civilians as their henchmen could get their hands on, not to mention the rapes, the beheadings, and the hostages. So let's pass this resolution. And let's forgive Sherman for 3 minutes of partisanship, but I was, after all, responding to other statements made, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Let me see. I agree. The sanctioned Iranian assets, $6 billion, should be put back in the deep freezer for a long time. There being, or is there any further discussion on the resolution? Not amendments, but on the resolution. Any further discussion on the resolution? There being no further discussion of the resolution, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Ms. Jacobs is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk shall distribute the amendment. Can you? Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to HRES 559, offered by Ms. Jacobs of California.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like the rest of my generation, I grew up in the shadow of 2 protracted wars. San Diego, the largest military community in the country, the community which I'm so proud to represent, paid the price. And Congress largely abdicated our responsibility. Our service members were sent into harm's way to achieve impossible missions, and Congress didn't take a single vote on that since I was in middle school. I know that this resolution does not actually authorize military force, but I am incredibly concerned that the vague language in HRES 559 could be taken as a green light for war against Iran, particularly in light of the current context in the region. That vague language could put my own community at risk. We all in this body agree that any use of force must be authorized by Congress. This shouldn't be controversial. And regardless of our different views about what's most effective to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, I hope we can at least agree that any decision about force should be made here in this body through specific statutory authorization and not through resolution with vague language. So I was offering a simple amendment to make it clear that nothing in this resolution can be construed to authorize the use of military force. Unfortunately, with conversations with the majority, they did not support that, so I will withdraw my amendment. But without my amendment included, I cannot support this bill.
The gentlelady withdraws her amendment. Are there any further amendments to the resolution? There being no further amendments, I move that the committee report HRES 559 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Have someone else. I request a roll call vote. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 2973, the Maritime Act of 2023. Bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 2973, to require the Secretary of Defense to develop, in cooperation with allies and partners in the Middle East, and integrated maritime domain awareness and interdiction capability, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment. At any point without objection, the Wagner Amendment, in the nature of a substitute circulated to members in advance, shall be considered as read and will be treated as original text for purposes of the amendment. Is there any discussion on the bill? Ms. Wagner is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member Meeks for holding this urgently needed markup. Today, we are advancing legislation that will give the U.S. and Israel critical tools to defend against brutal terrorists, Iran, and Iranian proxies. We are also sending a message of unequivocal bipartisan support for Israel. Israel is locked in a generational fight for survival against genocidal Hamas terrorists. The United States stands with Israel as it grieves the unthinkable loss of more than 1,400 innocent civilians, and it stands with Israel in its fight to eliminate the brutal terrorist group Hamas, period, full stop. Our ironclad commitment to Israel encompasses as well its ability to defend itself against the existential threat posed by Iran and its terrorist proxies. That is why I urge each of my colleagues to support H.R. 2973, the Maritime Act. This legislation that I'm leading with my good friends of the bipartisan, bicameral Abraham Accords Caucus, Chairman McMorris-Rogers, Representative Schneider, and Representative Tyrone. As we saw on October 7th, when Hamas launched the deadliest assault against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, Israel is facing a complex range of threats across all domains. On that bloody front and that tragic day, Hamas terrorists infiltrated Israeli communities by air, by land, and by sea to unleash bloodshed against civilians on a scale that Israel has not seen in its history. The Maritime Act requires the United States to develop a comprehensive strategy for the integration of maritime security capabilities with allies and partners across the Middle East. Iran and its terrorist proxies are increasingly aggressive in harassing American, Israeli, and even commercial ships. And we have seen that Hamas will use the sea domain to advance its abhorrent genocidal agenda against Israel. It is imperative that the U.S. convene responsible states to close this gap in regional security. The Maritime Act will kickstart that essential effort. The U.S.-Israel relationship is the linchpin of Middle Eastern security. The stability and the prosperity of our partnership brings to the region convinced Arab nations to take the unprecedented steps of normalizing relations with Israel, a far-sighted and courageous decision that is already unleashing pent-up economic growth. But China, Russia, and Iran, the new axis of evil, see this achievement as a threat. They want to use the tragedy unfolding in Israel to undo the Abraham Accords, and they will plunge nations and regions into chaos to do so. We cannot and we will not let this happen. For a peaceful, prosperous future for the region, Israel and its friends must draw closer together. The U.S. must continue to build ties, economic, security, and cultural, between Arab partners and Israel. I thank the chair and the ranking member for working with the Abraham Accords Caucus to include the Maritime Act in today's markup, and I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation so the U.S. can get to work on bolstering security in the Middle East. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Joe yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank both Rep. Brad Schneider, who was the Democratic co-sponsor of this bill, along with Rep. McMorris-Rogers, for bringing this bill to the committee today. It seeks to build on important diplomatic progress the Biden administration has sought to expand on and deepen as we face continued and persistent threats from Iran and its proxies in the Middle East. For some time, Iran has conducted disruptive naval operations in the Arab Gulf, threatening both U.S. personnel and interests as well as Gulf partners and commercial shipping. The U.S. Navy, along with key partners, has worked to develop a coordinated strategy with Gulf partners to counter such activities and has included various joint patrols, training engagements, and other efforts. This bill requires the Department of Defense, with the concurrence of the Secretary of State, to develop a strategy to broaden these efforts with partners and allies throughout the Middle East. It is a thorough and broader and more comprehensive strategy and approach to regional security and greater integration that we can better deter Iran and its proxies who continue to threaten our personnel and shared interests. I support this bill and the important strategy requirements it contains, and urge my colleagues to do so as well. Now yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Let me say I support this as well. I want to thank Mr. Schneider and Ms. Kathy McMorris-Rogers, Ms. Wagner, and others for bringing this bill forward. There being no discussion on the bill resolution. On the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Mr. Castro is recognized.
Chairman, I have number 75 at the desk.
Clerk shall distribute the amendment. Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2973, offered by Mr. Castro of Texas. Page 6, after line 3, insert the following. Limitation. A foreign country may be included with respect to the activities carried out under the section only if the Secretary of State certifies to the appropriate congressional committees that the country does not undertake military intelligence or other such cooperation with the People's Republic of China.
Without objection, further reading the amendments dispensed with. The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. There is significant and important value in supporting greater cooperation between Israel and other nations in the Middle East, particularly the Gulf countries. I support efforts like this that would facilitate cooperation between Israel and countries like the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia to address shared security challenges. Greater cooperation can also improve communication among these nations and set the conditions for more countries to normalize ties with Israel. The United States is uniquely equipped to play this role, but our efforts must also be in line with our own American interests. Both the Biden administration and the previous administration have rightly pointed out that the most significant national security threat the United States faces comes from the People's Republic of China. In fact, we in a bipartisan, overwhelmingly bipartisan way, set up a committee to deal with that issue this Congress. Beijing has been making significant inroads in other parts of the world, as we all know, including the Middle East, and I'm concerned about reports that it's developing stronger security ties with countries in the region. There are credible reports that the security forces of the People's Republic of China are establishing bases in the region and deepening cooperation on nuclear and ballistic missile technology with countries in the Middle East. If, under this bill, the United States is committing to continue to be an integral part of the security architecture of the Middle East, I think it's fairly reasonable to ask our partner countries to avoid a close defense or intelligence relationship with the People's Republic of China. For us to not do so would be to endanger national security secrets and American sensitive technology. For this reason, I ask my colleague to support this amendment and protect the national security of the United States of America. And I will say, Chairman, that I had a different version of this amendment that I was going to file, but after consultation, my office and the Office of Representative Schneider, I changed the language up so that we could work together and compromise on it, and that's the final language that you see in front of you. With that, I yield back.
Yeah, I thank the gentleman for his spirit of compromise. Is there any further discussion? Ms. Wagner is recognized.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and sadly, I have to still rise today in opposition to my good friend and ASEAN caucus co-chair, Representative Castro's amendment. While I strongly agree with the spirit and intent of this amendment, which I believe is to bolster our national security, the language is so broad, Mr. Chairman, that it undermines these goals. In fact, I think it endangers the goals of the underlying bill. The Maritime Act will promote peace and cooperation among Abraham Accords nations, establishing stronger security ties between Arab states, Israel, and the United States, and expanding opportunities for our militaries to work together and to build trust. This amendment both ties our diplomats' hands and signals to Abraham Accords countries that we are open to putting these historic peace agreements back on the negotiating table. During this moment of profound crisis for Israel and the Middle East, we must send a clear message to signatory nations that we are absolutely committed to the accords. And I remind them that partnership with the U.S. and Israel is the path to regional prosperity, not Iran and not the People's Republic of China. We absolutely must counter China's influence in the Middle East. This is a national security imperative, but the answer is not to end our cooperation with regional partners who are seeking to hedge against China, Russia, and Iran. This would play right into China's hands, and it would be a gift to Putin and Iran, whose regional influence the Abraham Accords seriously threatens. I've had the pleasure of working in a very bipartisan manner with Representative Castro for many years, as I mentioned before, on the ASEAN caucus, which we co-chair, and I know he is sincerely committed to combating the serious threat the People's Republic of China poses to American interests. I look forward to working with the representative to counter China's influence in Southeast Asia and beyond, but I must oppose this amendment, and I would urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Generally yields back. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment from Rep. Castro, which I thank him and Rep. Schneider for collaborating on, addresses a real and growing threat to the United States interests and the security of our personnel and facilities in the Middle East. As China aggressively expands its overseas footprint and relationships globally, our nation's top military, diplomatic, and intelligence leaders have expressed strong concern about the implications of such expansion and briefed many of us on potential consequences for the United States. More specifically, in the Arab Gulf, China has sought to dramatically expand its military and intelligence efforts, not only through deepening direct relationships with those governments, but in some cases constructing or expanding physical bases and installations. Through several open source reports and briefings members have received, I, along with many of my colleagues, are cognizant of the fact of these concerns and high stakes there. Therefore, this amendment adds an additional helpful reporting requirement mandating the Secretary of State certify to Congress that a country involved in the cooperative strategy described does not undertake military, intelligence, or other cooperation with China that is inconsistent with the United States' national interests or national security. We need to make sure, as we seek to enhance cooperation and collaboration among Gulf partners and our own military, we are not exposing or needlessly endangering our personnel, facilities, sensitive communications, or technologies to our adversaries. Mr. Castro's amendment accomplishes this and provides a helpful addition to this important initiative, and I support the amendment and urge all members to do so as well. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? There being no further discussion, question now occurs on the amendment offered by Representative Castro, 75. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, in the opinion of the chair, does have.
Sorry.
And I see a roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5826, No Paydays for Hostage Takers Act. The bill is circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 5826, to require a report on sanctions under the the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act. And
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, the Wilson Amendment in the nature of a substitute, number 68, circulated to members in advance, shall be considered as read and will be treated as original text for purposes of amendment. Is there any discussion on the bill? Mr. Wilson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for the inclusion of H.R. 5826, the No Paydays for Hostage Takers Act, in today's markup. The dictatorial regime in Tehran, which oppresses its citizens of Iran, has increased its inhuman policy of hostage-taking in recent years as it looks for ways to fund its murderous terrorist activities and oppression of the people of Iran. In 2021, Mohsen Razi, the former commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, former vice president of Iran for economic affairs, said, quote, "We'll take 1,000 American hostages. America will have to pay billions to get every single one freed. This is how we can solve our economic problems." End of quote. How clear could it be, their threats of death to Israel, death to America? Taking hostages is a murderous tactic in the war between dictators of rule of gun opposing democracy's rule of law. The axis of evil, Putin, Raisi, and Xi, must be stopped by peace through strength. Sadly, the September 11th announcement of all days of the release of $6 billion to the terrorist regime in Tehran in exchange for 5 Americans detained confirms this tactic works. American policy should be what was declared in 1797 by South Carolinian American Ambassador Charles Cotesworth Pinckney to France: millions for defense, not a penny for tribute. This bipartisan legislation deters the regime from hostage-taking and imposes penalties by requiring strict line-by-line accounting and oversight of the $6 billion should it be irresponsibly released, limits the ability for Iranian diplomats to travel at the United Nations, reiterates the ability of the U.S. to restrict the use of U.S. passports of travel to Iran to protect Americans. The horrific terror attacks on Israel by Iran-backed Hamas further underscores the barbarity of the regime as it seeks to fulfill its mandate of death to America, death to Israel. The Tehran regime must be held accountable for their murderous destabilization and barbaric, heinous crimes against humanity. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Well, I appreciate and understand, I appreciate what I understand to be my colleagues' aim to deter hostile actors in Iran or elsewhere from taking American hostages or wrongfully detaining them overseas. We must all work together and ensure that the State Department has all the resources and authorities from Congress that it needs to bring Americans home who've been unjustly held abroad and to offer them support that they need when they return home. I also understand and agree with my colleagues' intent to disincentivize this sort of behavior in the future and make it clear to anyone who would wrongfully detain one of our citizens that it will not be tolerated. However, I must also note my concern that some of the messages sent in this bill risk undermining our key partners in the broader community of the United States: government institutions, families, advocates, and others. This includes the current latitude afforded to the State Department's Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Roger Carstens, and his team, who are doing the challenging work to bring Americans wrongfully detained abroad home. And I'd like to offer my appreciation to the SPIFA team for the hard and difficult work it continues to undertake on behalf of the American people. We need to empower that office and the families of wrongfully detainees that rely on its vital assistance and advocacy, not inadvertently burden it with extensive reporting or overly restrictive policy prescriptions. I'm also deeply concerned by the notion that we would restrict the freedom of movement of the American people, something that is fundamental to our liberty, and specifically the impact such a move would have on hundreds of thousands of Iranian Americans who expect our government, unlike the regime in Tehran, to respect their fundamental rights. As such, we should not take lightly the proposed invalidation of U.S. passports for travel to Iran or anywhere else, and I would request this language removed before I could support this bill being on the suspension calendar. The legislation also requires the executive branch to submit 37 reports to Congress, many with extensive and burdensome requirements. We want our sanctions and hostage affairs officials focused on freezing assets and freeing Americans, not necessarily box-checking exercises. I would think that there could be a bipartisan agreement to get the reports in the bill down to a more reasonable number. With these concerns aired, I nevertheless welcome the commitment of Representative Wilson and many other members on this committee on both sides of the aisle to make sure the U.S. government's approach on hostages and wrongful detention is smart and effective. So I hope our colleagues will work with us to address these concerns before this bill moves forward. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Moskowitz is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for bringing H.R. 5826 and Representative Wilson for sponsoring this legislation. The No Paydays for Hostage Takers Act before the committee this morning. The legislation that Rep. Wilson and I have introduced earlier this month would deter Iran and other hostile governments and individuals from hostage taking or wrongfully detaining U.S. nationals by imposing sanctions and other strict penalties. While I served in the Florida legislature, I represented the family of Bob Levinson, who was the longest held hostage in U.S. history, who died in Iranian custody. During his captivity, I watched and worked with the family as he missed birthdays, graduations, weddings, as the U.S. government tried to get information about him and how his well-being was. I saw the weight that the family bore, constantly afraid for their loved one, never knowing if he would come home, having to miss all that his family was experiencing while living in the hell of the Iranian regime. We now see families of approximately 200 people, including a number of Americans, living in hell in Gaza under the hostage-taking of Hamas. It just came out that of the 200 hostages that Hamas has taken, 30 of them are children. We've seen these videos of babies and children and teens, mothers, fathers. We've seen a Holocaust survivor taken, a person who never thought again in their life they would ever be taken hostage. And so this is unacceptable. It breaks my heart, and it's why I'm working on a bipartisan basis on this piece of legislation. The No Paydays for Hostage Takers Act will ensure that hostile groups who take American hostages face sharp reprisals and do not receive financial incentive. With that being said, it's an important note, because of the misinformation that was put out in the weeks after the deal was announced, that not a single dollar of the $6 billion, not a single dollar of the $6 billion has moved. And that's an important correction, because information in today's day and age is important to make sure that the facts as they are displayed. And with that, I urge my colleagues to support this important piece of legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Ms. Jacobs is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will distribute the amendment. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5826, offered by Ms. Jacobs of California. Strike Section 9 and insert the following. Section 9, report on strategy to communicate risks for travel to Iran. Sense of Congress. It is the sense of Congress that the Secretary of State should engage in a strategy to underscore the imminent.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments. Dispense with. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am incredibly proud that San Diego has a strong, vibrant diaspora community, including many from Iran. And annually, tens of thousands of Americans travel to Iran to reunite with relatives, to celebrate milestones, and to maintain the familial bonds that distance and politics stretch but never break. That's why I find Section 9 of H.R. 5826, with its directive to the Secretary of State to invalidate U.S. passports for travel to Iran, to be so concerning. Restricting the freedom of movement of ordinary families in the U.S. doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't enhance our national security. State Department has already recognized and warned Americans of the risks of traveling to Iran, like kidnapping, detention, or instability. Instead of imposing punitive restrictions on our citizens, we should enhance our strategies to protect them. Rather than an outright ban, my amendment would direct the State Department to report to Congress the current dangers associated with travel to Iran, assess the efficacy of existing advisories, and propose enhanced measures for communicating risks and protecting our citizens abroad. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, which upholds our core values while addressing the geopolitical complexities we face. I yield back.
Would my friend yield?
Oh, I yield to my friend.
I thank my good friend, and I want to support this amendment. You know, we are the land of the brave and home of the free, or home of the brave and land of the free. We ought not to be in the position of prohibiting Americans from traveling, frankly, anywhere. And as Ms. Jacobs points out, by actually facilitating family visits and other interchanges with Iran, we have a better chance over time of effectuating the kind of positive change we want to see. We have other examples where, in fact, we've had strict travel bans, and they did not produce at all the desired results we sought. In fact, they managed to shore up the regime and keep it in power for more than a half a century. So allowing flexibility and respecting the fact that there are Iranian Americans with family in Iran, and allowing them to have their family connections, their family celebrations, I think is really important. I think this amendment does that, while also allowing us to monitor it, to make sure that if there were some severe reason to restrict that travel, the State Department would be monitoring it and informing Congress as to the whys and wherefores of that. So I think this is a thoughtful amendment. I think it improves the bill. I'm happy to support it, and I thank my friend for yielding.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
This amendment addresses my concerns about hasty and unhelpful restrictions on Americans' freedom of movement with the Secretary of State to take the step to invalidate U.S. passports for travel to Iran. I appreciate the serious risks that U.S. travelers to Iran may encounter and have welcomed the State Department's Level 4 travel advisory, warning Americans not to travel to Iran, quote, due to the risk of kidnapping, the arbitrary arrest and detention of U.S. citizens, and the danger of civil unrest. I also welcome the Department's effort with respect to Iran and globally to expand indicators in its travel advisories, specifically related to the risk of wrongful detention abroad. But it's not a small thing to potentially limit the freedom of movement of thousands of Americans, including Iranian Americans with loved ones in Iran. By invalidating U.S. passports for travel to Iran, I have expressed similar concerns in other situations, such as Cuba, where Americans' freedom of movement has been curtailed. The U.S. government is not an authoritarian or anti-democratic regime. We have long committed to do all in our power to protect our citizens' most fundamental human rights. So I support this amendment, which asks only for precisely what we need here, a more detailed understanding of the imminent danger to public health or physical safety of U.S. travelers to Iran, with the State Department and what the State Department is doing to communicate travel risk and what more it needs to do so effectively. And with that, I yield back.
Would my friend yield for a question?
Yes.
Is my friend aware of any evidence, empirical evidence, that a ban on travel of American citizens has led to goals being achieved with respect to relations between us and that particular country?
No.
I thank my friend.
Yes.
I'll just comment that there's a range of different approaches to different countries. We have a virtual travel ban with State Department can give waivers to going to North Korea because a very high percentage of the people from the United States that go North Korea are held hostage. As the gentlelady from California points out, there are tens of thousands of Americans who visit Iran, and only a few are held hostage. But we do see that in spite of the travel ban, when somebody is held hostage by the Iranian government, the response of ordinary Americans isn't, oh, well, we warned you, so you're on your own. We do everything possible to bring Americans back, and Iran will occasionally find this useful. But I'm not, given the fact that so many Americans go, I'm not prepared to ban it all right now.
Would Mr. Meeks yield again?
Yield.
I think it's important with respect to Mr. Sherman's intervention that the question I put to you was not are individuals at risk. People take risks all the time when they travel. The question was, is there any evidence of that kind of broad prohibition effectuating change in the behavior of the country involved? And your answer was?
No.
I thank my friend.
I'll ask the gentleman to yield as well and point out we're not doing this. Obviously, the purpose of this bill is not to improve relations with the Islamic Republic. The purpose of this bill is to protect Americans from being held hostage. And it is true that we warn Americans that they might be held hostage. But the harm is not just to the individual American. Yes, they and their families suffer while they're held hostage, but then American suffers when we make major concessions to get them out. And no one on this committee is going to say that we will turn our back on an American simply because they didn't notice that it was a level 4 restriction. So as I say, I'm not ready to go for this bill, but I would say that if this was some country that didn't hold our people hostage ever, that improving relations through travel would be high up on my list. But for every tens of, every American that goes to Iran could be a hostage. And as a hostage, the harm is to the family, the person, and the United States. I yield back.
And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any other members seek recognition? Mr. Wilson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment by my friend Congresswoman Jacobs and President Connolly and Ranking Member Meeks, which removes a critical provision urging the Secretary of State to declare United States passports invalid for travel to Iran. I've been honored to work with Iranian Americans who are such an inspiration as they pursue justice and freedom for their families while contributing so meaningfully to America. I know their commitments to their loved ones who are oppressed by the murderous regime in Tehran. Sadly, we're in a situation today we did not choose, where we must act to prevent further hostage-taking of Americans by a dictatorial regime. In the war of dictators against democracies, the axis of evil, Putin, the regime in Tehran, the Chinese Communist Party. I was grateful to work on bipartisan legislation to prevent Americans from traveling to North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, using a United States passport following the murderous death of Otto Warmbier at the hands of dictator Kim Jong-un's regime. And I appreciate Congressman Sherman reiterating again, we have this in place already for the dictatorial regime in North Korea. I appreciate that there are differences as we want Iranian Americans to maintain close ties with their families in Iran. It's important to note that Iran already does not recognize dual nationality and treats Iranian Americans as Iranian requiring an Iranian passport for entry and exit. The inability to travel on the United States passport would likely have little effect on the appreciated Iranian diaspora, which is so important all across America. This amendment calls for a strategy to underscore the dangers of travel to Iran. The dangers couldn't be more clear. I urge opposition to this amendment, and I yield back.
Would my friend yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
I thank you so much, Mr. Wilson. I really appreciate the motivation behind the amendment, but I think there's a certain paternalism we need to guard against in protecting people from themselves. We are Americans. We are free people. We are free to make decisions, including bad ones. There are lots of countries, not only Iran, where Americans are at risk when they travel, including at risk of being imprisoned under false charges. You mentioned North Korea, but there's Cuba, there's China, there's Russia, there's Nicaragua, there's a whole host of countries where Americans put themselves at risk when they travel there. And I don't think the solution is for us to have a blanket prohibition, country by country, cordoning off large chunks of the world's geography because Americans are at risk. I don't want any American to be at risk. I don't want any American harmed or jailed. But I'm not sure, in fact, I'm pretty sure the solution is not a blanket prohibition on the right to travel, even if you know the risks in advance. I thank my good friend for yielding.
And Mr. President, I would like to point out, former President of NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I want to clarify the position of Congressman Connolly. But in light of that, indeed, we have this for North Korea. We already have, Iran already restricts persons from the United States coming into their country. But with the $6 billion ransom announced on the anniversary of 9/11, how crazy is this? The potential of $1 billion per person, and then we can only go back, the statement by the Iranian officials was 2021. It was 2 years ago that they said they looked forward to holding Americans as ransom for $1 billion each. Now, I would have thought that was absurd, except it's happened. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Representative Jacobs, number 129. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. For what purposes? General Lady seek recognition. A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? Further proceedings on this bill are postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 340, the Hamas International Financing Prevention Act. The bill was circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 340, to impose sanctions with respect to foreign support for terrorist organizations, including Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, the massed amendment in the nature of a substitute, number 117, circulated members in advance, shall be considered as read and will be treated as original text for purposes of amendments. Is there any discussion on the bill? Mr. Mast is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. The purpose of this bill is simple. The Palestinians that conducted this attack on Israel, they didn't do it by themselves. They didn't do it without support from the outside. They didn't do it without support from other countries, from perhaps nonprofit organizations, as we might call them here in the U.S., or non-government entities or charity groups. The support was far-reaching, and it has been for many years. Whether it's the financial support, the support of intelligence, the support of propaganda, the support of ordnance, rockets, artillery, grenades, the support of small arms. It's been extensive, and it extends well beyond the borders of the Gaza Strip and the borders of the West Bank. The purpose of this legislation, very specifically, is to oppose Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and Lion's Den and any other affiliate or successor group that's using goods to include medicines or dual-use items or other things to smuggle weapons and materials and other items that are used for war against Israelis, used for terrorism against Israel. To be very specific about this, it's to name, identify, sanction all of those entities that assist in sponsoring or providing financial services or financial goods, material services or goods, technological services or goods. Any of those aforementioned entities that might provide any of that have absolutely enabled the attack that we just witnessed to take place, that they be sanctioned in terms of asset freezes, arms embargoes, travel bans, import-export controls, you name it. If they're finding a way to get it into the hands of the Palestinians and those in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank that conducted these attacks by any name, we should be doing everything that we can to stop that from occurring. We have the capabilities to prevent that from occurring. We have to exercise those capabilities to make sure that it does not happen and that we can stand by and say that we did everything possible to make sure that never again was exactly what we fought for. And in that, Mr. Chairman, I yield you the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields the remainder of his time. Any further discussion on the bill? Ms. Manning is recognized. Sorry. Mr. Meeks.
Hamas has been, since its inception, a military and political entity dedicated for one thing: the destruction of Israel. And rather than addressing the needs and concerns of the Palestinian people, Hamas has furthered their suffering. This group has used Palestinians as human shields, has terrorized its own population. And of course, this October the 7th raid and destruction, kidnapping, rape of Israeli people. And it has destabilized the Gaza Strip. Since 2001, Hamas has launched tens of thousands of rockets at Israeli and Palestinian civilians, conducted countless terror attacks, engaged in hostage-taking, and tortured the Palestinian people. The State Department first designated Hamas as a foreign terrorist organization in 1997. And the EU and other Western countries have done the same. But today, passage of this legislation will provide more tools for this and future administrations to hold Hamas accountable for its terrorism and brutality. And while Hamas leaders don't have assets in the United States, new sanctions have been unveiled by the Biden administration this week that will increase pressure on some of the countries that host them. With this legislation, the United States will now be able to penalize third parties who provide assistance to Hamas. While we desire to put more pressure on Hamas, we also want to make certain that American and partner NGOs and governments are still able to assist the people of Gaza with their humanitarian needs. The waiver present in this legislation, while strict, will allow that assistance to continue. We have verified this with the State and Treasury Departments. So therefore, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting Mr. Mass's bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? Ms. Manning is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am proud to speak in support of H.R. 340, the Hamas International Financing Prevention Act, a bipartisan bill introduced by our colleagues Brian Mast and Josh Gottheimer to impose sanctions on the terrorist group Hamas. On October 7th, we woke in horror to find Hamas's brutal and despicable terrorist attacks, firing rockets at innocent civilians, storming the Israeli border and invading Israel, going house to house, murdering babies, executing parents in front of their children, massacring 260 young people at a music festival. Hamas has killed 31 U.S. citizens and more than 1,400 Israelis in its attacks, while taking 200 people hostage in Gaza, including babies and toddlers. And just today, we learned that an 80-year-old American citizen and her 13-year-old granddaughter, who were kidnapped by Hamas terrorists from their kibbutz on October 7th, have now been found dead. So let us remember, Hamas terrorists are not militants, they are not freedom fighters, they are not a civil resistance movement. They are a brutal foreign terrorist organization which is dedicated to the destruction of the State of Israel and the murder of Jews. It is no secret that this is their goal. It's plainly stated in their charter. It's important also to recognize that Hamas has no regard for the lives of innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza, the very people they were elected to govern, who suffer under Hamas. Let there be no mistake. Hamas bears responsibility for their pain as well. All countries around the world should join the U.S. in demanding Hamas immediately release all of the hostages currently held in Gaza. I am pleased that yesterday the Treasury Department imposed a round of additional sanctions on senior Hamas officials and their financial backers. We need to continue to bring pressure to bear on Hamas and cut off their flow of resources. That is why this bipartisan legislation imposes sanctions on foreign entities that provide material and financial support to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, while also providing for important humanitarian exemptions. Once again, I thank my colleagues for their work on this bill. I urge support for it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Phillips is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Meeks, for bringing this bill before the committee. But let me start first by thanking my Republican friends and colleagues for defending the State of Israel, for supporting the Jewish community, both here and around the world, during days and weeks and months that we surely need it. It's meaningful to us, it's important to us, and we are feeling feelings and fears and threats that I think none of us ever anticipated feeling in this country as Americans, and I want to thank you for that sincerely. The attack that Hamas perpetrated on Israel on October 7th was just despicable. Unspeakable evil, over 1,500 human beings murdered in cold blood, thousands wounded, and almost 200 believed to be held hostage in Gaza. One of them is this little 3-year-old girl, Abigail, whose father was shot with her in his arms, and she kidnapped and taken to Gaza. And I just want all of us to think about her, her parents, and other little children, both in Israel and in Gaza right now. And that's why we serve on this committee, to try to prevent these nauseating experiences of loss of life. As members of Congress, it is our responsibility to do everything in our power to ensure that these terrorists are held to account and not able to use United States financial institutions to facilitate their despicable work. And that's why I was pleased to see the Biden administration sanction 10 Hamas members to disrupt its financial network. And that is why I stand ready to support this measure, which imposes further sanctions targeting Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. However, I am disappointed about the implications that such a broad imposition of sanctions will have on Palestinian civilians, and I do want to separate the two. It is my belief, having spoken to many, that Hamas does not represent the majority of Palestinian civilians. In fact, I believe Hamas to be both the enemy of Israel, of Palestinians, and the free world. And the chilling effect that those proposed sanctions will have on trusted NGO partners delivering critical humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians is also on my mind. So in this moment of tragedy, I just ask that we remember that the majority of Palestinians are not Hamas and that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. So to that end, I support Representative Jacobs' amendment that would strengthen humanitarian exceptions in the bill, and I look forward to working to further confront Hamas and other terrorist organizations while continuing to support innocent civilians all around the world. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Moskowitz is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't repeat too much of what my colleagues have said, but I want to point out a couple of things, because I think it's important over the last couple of days as we saw that horrific, tragic incident at the hospital in Gaza. First of all, the Gaza Ministry of Health is Hamas. So any information that comes out of Gaza is put out by a terrorist organization. It is and was deeply disturbing to see the international media immediately take the word of Hamas that caused protests and riots around the world. It caused meetings with our allies to be canceled, for the president to see colleagues in this body immediately blame Israel with zero proof that Israel had anything to do with the tragedy at that hospital. But yet, when Israel said they didn't do it, everyone said, you must have proof. You must show us satellite imagery. You must show us the audio recordings. You must show us the missile trajectory. You must show us the size of the crater. Hamas, no proof. Israel, prove it. It is a disgusting, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel double standard. It is part of why this bill and resolution is so important. There can be no ceasefire with a terrorist organization while they're holding 200 hostages, Americans, children, Holocaust survivors. What kind of policy would that be if we let people capture Americans and then immediately say ceasefire? What kind of message would that send to all the other people that want to cause harm to America, that you can just take our people and immediately we enter into a ceasefire? You know, this is the first time that I can recall the stories my grandmother, who escaped Berlin, Germany, as part of the Kindertransport for the Holocaust. The pictures you've seen at the Holocaust Memorial, the stories you've told, the videos you've seen, Schindler's List. This is the first time that I think the Jewish community in modern times now understands that there are people, terrorist organizations, others protesting around the world and in this country, that want to see Hitler's dream fulfilled. And that is what Hamas is committed to. Hamas is not just committed to wiping a country off the earth, the international media. It's abhorrent. And so I want to thank the sponsor, Congressman Mass, for bringing this forward. I just want to remind people when they say there's two sides to this story. Let me tell you something. Raping women is not resistance. Taking children hostage is not resistance. Taking a Holocaust survivor is not resistance, and killing 1,300 civilians, children in front of their parents, parents in front of their children, decapitating people is not resistance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Amendment in the nature, yes. Mr. Chairman, I have an
Mr.
amendment in the nature of a
recognized.
substitute.
Clerk shall distribute the massed amendment in the nature of a substitute. Okay.
Thank you.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 340, offered by Mr. Mast of Florida. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist group International Financing Prevention Act.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr.
The
Chairman.
gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
There are both positive and negative aspects of this ANS vis-a-vis the introduced version of this legislation. Importantly, the ANS removes the counterproductive exception for importation of goods, which undermines sanctions programs. More concerningly, it changes the humanitarian exception to a humanitarian waiver, which will cause more de-risking from potential donors. Given that the bill's sanctions currently do not sunset, this change in language is concerning. And I would ask for continued dialogue on remending this issue. Nonetheless, given the importance of Congress demonstrating unity against Hamas, which is in the forefront of all of our minds at this moment, I will not oppose the ANS.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment, the Mast amendment? There being no further discussion, do any members wish to offer an amendment to the Mast amendment in the nature of substitute? Ms. Jacobs is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk shall distribute the amendment. Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 340, offered by Ms. Jacobs of California. Page 4, beginning line 23, amend subsection G to read as following. Humanitarian exemption. The following activities shall be exempt from sanctions under this section.
Without objection, a further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The actions of Hamas, particularly the reprehensible attack on October 7th, are beyond justification. They've destabilized the region and destroyed and changed lives forever. I condemn these attacks, and I support Israel's right to defend itself and echo the calls for Hamas to immediately release all hostages. But in our pursuit of security, we can't lose our humanity. The sanctions proposed in this bill, while aimed at upholding peace, potentially restrict humanitarian aid from reaching innocent Palestinians in need. The situation in Gaza is dire, and it's not about politics, it's about people. It's about preventing a humanitarian catastrophe. So I'm thankful for the Biden administration's efforts, especially the recent breakthrough allowing aid trucks through the Rafah crossing. However, this bill, in its current form, risks undermining these diplomatic and humanitarian efforts. The original draft, Mr. Mast's own original draft of this bill, had a more straightforward humanitarian exemption, one that provided a more viable pathway for essential aid, food, medicine, and other life-saving supplies to reach those trying to survive in Gaza. Both the State Department and the Treasury Department prefer this version of the humanitarian exemption to ensure that humanitarian assistance can get in. And so I was incredibly disappointed to see that the majority modified this humanitarian clause by requiring a case-by-case waiver, which will inevitably slow down the provision of assistance. All my amendment would do is return to the original language, again, the original language in Mr. Mast's own original draft, which provides an exemption only for the life-saving, necessary humanitarian assistance to those most in need. I urge my colleagues to support this common-sense amendment that takes the humanitarian exemption back to Mr. Mast's own original draft, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion of the amendment? Mr. Mast is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for offering an amendment. I disagree with your amendment. And the purpose of us amending any piece of legislation is to make the bill better, to make the legislation better. And my friend, Mr. Moskowitz, I think he spoke very passionately, very eloquently, and from the heart about what it is that we're dealing with here. And I think if you reflect on what he said, and to reflect on what you just said, my colleague, Ms. Jacobs, any assistance should be slowed down. Any assistance. Because I would challenge anybody in here to point to me which Palestinian is Hamas and which one is an innocent civilian. Which is the one, the child that was poking the Israeli children, the children that were poking other Israeli children, and which ones exactly are the innocent ones? Which are the ones that were standing by somewhere along the border saying, no, turn around. No, return that person. No, don't take that person hostage. No, don't conduct that rape, that murder, that beheading, that whatever. It should absolutely be every effort made to slow down any perceived assistance that's going there, and to perhaps bring in equivalencies in some part. Have the conversation of, would this be something we would talk about immediately following Pearl Harbor or immediately following 9/11? I'll be happy to yield to you in a moment if you like. I see you reaching for your button. And I would argue that shouldn't be something that we should argue, that after Pearl Harbor, after 9/11, we should seek ceasefire, seek not having the greatest violence of action over anybody that comes against us, seek finding ways to support them and assist them in the most expedient way. That would be the opposite of what I would propose supporting. It looks like you want to have a dialogue on this. I'm happy to do so.
Well, thank you, Mr. Maston. And I think we both agree that Israel has a right to defend itself, should be doing everything it can to get the hostages back. I think what we disagree on is this question of humanitarian assistance and the humanitarian circumstances in Gaza. I feel very strongly that the 5-year-old who currently is having a hard time being able to get access to any water, to any food, has nothing to do with Hamas. That you can't blame the children who are living in Gaza for the actions of adults that don't represent them. And I think it is not only about the Palestinian children, it's about our own humanity. That is the reason why we should make sure humanitarian assistance should get in. And to your comparison to after Pearl Harbor, the US government put American citizens of Japanese descent into camps because we let our fear and our anger get in the way of our humanity. And I wish that there had been members of Congress who were there saying that we need to pause, we need to make sure we are doing the humanitarian thing in addition to doing the security thing, and that actually doing the humanitarian thing in the long term is better for our and for Israel's safety and security. Thank you.
Always happy to hear you out. Again, I think there are other things we can speak about peripheral to this that haven't really been brought up in this. Another reason for the purpose of slowing any aid is that to get anything into the Gaza Strip, that is the mechanism by which smuggling takes place. To smuggle the things that are used to kill Jews, to kill Israelis, to make capable what they have proven their resolve, which is they will live alongside Jews only so long as they need to, up until the point that they can conduct enough planning, reconnaissance, intelligence, and strategizing to execute a mass murder. And that being the resolve of the entity that may receive some sort of humanitarian assistance somewhere from some entity, yes, I believe it should absolutely have the greatest deliberation, no matter how much it slows it down. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
I support Representative Jacobs' amendment. One of the most difficult, and I really appreciate her response to Mr. Mass. One of the most difficult and daunting events that happened in the United States was 9/11. I voted because I wanted to go and get everyone that was involved. ISIS came later, Al-Qaeda. But I didn't want to, and if we bombed anywhere, and we did make mistakes then, that we should make sure that we were able to make sure that our humanitarian side prevailed, and we give assistance to those in need, and not just say we don't care about innocent individuals, because then we lose our humanitarian argument completely. This Hamas terrorist group, there's nothing that's humane about them. But Hamas is not all the Palestinian people. It's not the Palestinians. We've got to make sure that that distinction is clearly made. Hamas is not the Palestinian people. I can recall times in the United States of America where a black person would be accused of something, and as a result, the whole town was wiped out and no aid coming in. Those that commit the crime, we've got to go after them. This amendment restores what I know was the humanitarian exemption that was introduced in the version of the bill, which I would have liked to have seen retained. I believe it offers a clear and transparent and vetted pathway to provide crucial life-saving materials to those suffering in Gaza. And I think when we show that, that helps us and helps them on the ground to point out those who are members of Hamas. Such exemptions have proven effective throughout American sanctions policy. Humanitarian relief in Gaza is morally the right thing to do, but also in America's foreign policy interests. A waiver, as opposed to an exception, will create more bureaucratic and more de-risking by leading humanitarian organizations. The original language in Mr. Mass's bill, Mr. Mass had in his bill, and it was there for years until it was changed earlier this week, I believe was more thoughtfully crafted than the language in the current ANS. And as such, I firmly support the Jacobs Amendment. And I think that we could have a clear message from everyone, because I think that, I know Mr. Mass has the best of intent. And he wants to go and make sure that those that committed these horrendous acts don't get anything to help them further kill anyone. I know his intent on this. It's a good cause. But I just ask that we've got to make sure that we try to make sure that innocent folks get access to humanitarian need, and not say that because of Hamas, you've got to starve too, and we're not going to try to do something that's humane. But again, this is so serious, and I just would hate that we even have to have this argument, because I know the basis of what we're talking about, we all agree upon. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition? Mr. Castro is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I strongly support Representative Jacobs' amendment. As all of us watched and heard about the events of October 7th, I think it filled all of us with rage. And we as Americans were enraged after September 11th. So I think there is an understanding of that. But as President Biden alluded to a few days ago, I believe while he was in Israel, that rage, that anger also led us to make mistakes. And I think it's dangerous when we legislate in rage. One of the basic things that we should be able to agree on, I think, is that humanitarian aid should be provided to the people of Gaza, or at least allowed in. Many, if not most of the people living in Gaza, and there's millions of people living in Gaza, never voted for Hamas. There haven't been elections since 2006. And we kept hearing and we believe that Hamas is not the Palestinian people, but there are many Palestinians who are paying the price for what Hamas did, including many Palestinian children who are dying now because of what Hamas did. And so I believe in all of it, that as a baseline, we should be able to say that humanitarian aid should be able to get in there efficiently and effectively. So for that reason, I support Ms. Jacobs' amendment. I'm going to yield back to the chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Jacobs, number 128, to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Ms. Jacobs. A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? Hearing no further amendments, further proceedings on this bill are postponed.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3266, the Peace and Tolerance in Palestinian Education Act. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 3266, to require the Secretary of State to submit annual reports reviewing the curriculum used by the Palestinian Authority and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read, and open to amendment at any point. Is there any discussion on the bill?
Yes.
I recognize Representative Sherman.
I'm pleased to introduce this bill as I have in the prior two Congresses. I want to thank Chairman McCall for bringing this bill to this markup. It is the Peace and Tolerance in Palestinian Education Act. This bill has passed this committee without dissent in two prior Congresses. Those were voice votes. This time I'll ask for a recorded vote because I'm told that the majority is more likely to bring up a bill on the House floor as a suspension if it has been the subject of a roll call vote. I won't call a roll call vote to try to put anybody on the spot or waste any time, but I will call for a roll call vote this time. I want to thank so many of my colleagues on this committee who have supported and co-sponsored this legislation over the years. I want to thank Representative Mast as the lead Republican, and thank co-sponsors Moskowitz, Salazar, Schneider, Manning, Chris Smith, Costa, Lawler, Radagwagen, Sheriff Phyllis McCormick, regular McCormick, Keene, and Liu. Roughly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans have co-sponsored this bill. What we saw on October 7th shattered all of our hearts. What we understand is that this is the outcome of how generations of children in Gaza and the West Bank are taught to embrace death and terrorism. The schools receive very substantial U.S. aid. They are run chiefly by UNRWA, the UN agency, and this agency receives U.S. aid without sufficient accountability. For years, the United States has been the top donor to the Palestinian people. Keep that in mind. The government whose president was there in Israel yesterday saying that we stand by Israel is also the top donor to the Palestinian people, exceeding the amount of any of the oil-rich states with whom the Palestinians share a heritage and language. And of course, our aid goes to the Palestinian Authority and the UN agency, UNRWA. But American support should not be a blank check. American dollars must be spent in accordance with American values. Just one example. On March 11th, 1978, Dalal Mughrabi and 10 other PLO militants, terrorists, hijacked 2 civilian buses and killed 38 of their civilian passengers, including 13 children, in what is now known as the Coastal Road Massacre. Today, and last year, and the year before that, and the year before that, Palestinian children educated in schools run by the UN and the Palestinian Authority used textbooks describing Mughrabi as a crown of the nation, with a full chapter discussing the massacre in detail and exalting her for heroism. It's not surprising that when we look at Gaza today, we see death because of the education that has gone on. UNRWA has made commitments to address this issue in its 2021 framework of cooperation, but it doesn't actually come through on those commitments. What this bill does is require the State Department to give us a report on the educational materials used in the West Bank and Gaza with our money. The bill will provide Congress with the information we need to respond. Hopefully, it will be used by the State Department to push UNRWA and to push the Palestinian Authority in the right direction. It is time to stop educating Palestinian children for death and terrorism. It is not a great accomplishment and should not be taught as a great accomplishment to Palestinian children to die or to kill civilians. That's why this bill takes the first step. It's a modest bill in that it is just a first step toward a hopefully a future generation of Palestinians who are educated for peace rather than for terrorism. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Mast is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I want to thank my friend, Mr. Sherman, for his work on this bill and for allowing me to work on it with him. I think there needs to be a realization among many of our colleagues, a coming to Jesus moment, as you might say, that Hamas is literally Palestinians. I keep hearing it said that Hamas is not Palestinians. It doesn't represent all of Palestine, and I wouldn't use it as an absolute. But young people from the time of grade school in the Gaza Strip are given the pedigree to become Hamas, trained to become Hamas from their algebra and arithmetic to their reading, writing, and geography. We have a picture up here. This is obviously a historic photo dating back to World War II, eerily similar to what just happened in the last couple days. Young child saying, calling for the mother, prodded by Palestinian youth. Those Palestinian youth with the pedigree being trained up to become the next Hamas. So don't confuse it that it's somebody else. Year after year after year in this committee, every time, whether it's in this room or another committee room, that we have somebody in here to talk about the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, or the Taylor Force Act, or another barrage of rockets going on that happens year after year. Whenever we have people in here, I ask them the same question, and I get the same answer over and over, whether it's a Republican witness or a Democrat witness, whether it's somebody that claims to be self-proclaimed polling experts of any Palestinian-controlled area. You name it, the answer is the same, that Hamas would win a popular election, and that's why they don't have the elections there. We know Hamas has won popular elections there, not since, I believe, 2006, as was mentioned before, because they don't have them anymore at this point. But it is well documented on both sides that Hamas is the Palestinians. Everybody should let that sink in and recognize that. They weren't out there reporting their cousins, their nephews, their uncles, their whomever, saying, this is what they're about to do. Stand ready and do what you can to prevent this. Those weren't the videos that you saw. They weren't out there creating mobs standing against the people being pulled into the Gaza Strip who would become hostages, hundreds of hostages, in tunnels. We don't know if being tortured, killed, used as human shields. We don't know, but we didn't see them being stopped by the people keep saying the innocent Palestinians. That didn't take place. Let's give some examples of how their pedigree is shaped from the very beginning. Palestinian sixth graders, grammar exercise, requires them to add the correct verb to the sentences. The jihad warriors fought in defense of their homeland, and the believers rushed to respond the call to jihad. That's a little bit of their grammar. Another example, fourth grade Palestinian math problem. The number of martyrs in the first Intifada is 2,026 martyrs, and the number of martyrs of the Al-Aqsa Intifada is 5,050. The number of martyrs in the two Intifadas is how many martyrs? That's their pedigree. Let's go to another one. Seventh grade physics problem, Newton's second law. During the first Palestinian uprising, Palestinian youths used slingshots to confront the soldiers of the Zionist occupation and defend themselves from their treacherous bullets. What is the relationship between the elongation of slingshots rubber and the tensile strength affecting it? Using it for science. Let's use another one. Geography question. Palestinian sixth graders to define the borders of Palestine, which completely erases Israel's existence. People need to move away from this idea of saying that the Palestinians are not Hamas and that Hamas are not the Palestinians. This is what they trained them up to be. This is their pedigree. This is what they've proven to be. And I think you would be hard-pressed right now to find the Palestinian that is not in support of the hostages and the killing that took place, as opposed to the ones that stood against it. I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion?
I've got to respond to that, and then I'm going to give my remarks. Mr. Mast, are you Ku Klux Klan? No. Because there was Ku Klux Klan that raised white people to hate black people. And in their books and what they taught every day.
Let me know when you want to
respond. And the Ku Klux Klan, today, they're still here. I get remarks. I get phone calls in my office from people calling me and folks in my office and teaching other kids that I'm less than a human being. I don't say all white people are Ku Klux Klan. I don't put them all in one category. Everybody don't belong. All Palestinians don't belong to Hamas. Just like all white people don't belong to the Ku Klux Klan.
Do you want a response?
No.
You sure? Because you made it.
I'm sure. I heard you already.
You didn't hear enough yet, then.
I heard you. I don't want to hear any more of it.
You should hear some more, because
I don't want to hear any more of it.
if you want to be willfully naive, do
it's
so.
my time, Mr. Mass.
Be willfully naive.
It's my time.
Willfully naive.
I'm tired of hearing that.
You're ignoring the truth.
We came here today to talk about a terrorist group that's killed individuals in Israel, not a people.
We should have a real dialogue.
And it wasn't all people. My time. I don't want to hear from you.
You're going to.
My time. I don't want to hear from you.
You still will.
Yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, you say something.
Okay. Let's have this conversation.
No, I'm not having a conversation with you.
You just said say
You're
so.
not worthy of having a conversation with on this.
I would argue differently.
Madam Chair, we need to order. It's the gentleman's time.
Right now, the time is Mr. Mix. Continue.
The United States and many of our allies have long been concerned about Palestinian textbooks that contain blatant anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist references that incite hatred and violence towards Jewish people. In May, the European Parliament went so far as to pass a resolution condemning the Palestinian Authority over the hateful content of its textbooks and conditioning future funding for education on the removal of anti-Semitic material. The United Nations Relief Works Agency, known as UNRWA, who administers many schools in the Gaza Strip and West Bank, is required by their mandate to use host country books. Let me say that again in another way. UNRWA does not write Palestinian textbooks. The Palestinians do, and UNRWA is required to use host nation books under their mandate. The bill before us asks the Secretary of State to write a report to Congress that reviews the curriculum, including textbooks, leaflets, pamphlets, magazines, and other instructional materials used in UNRWA schools. This report will be important, and it will help both the Congress and the executive branch understand the full scope of the problem. Work to improve these textbooks and remove the content that is not only untrue, but leads to further violence and instability in the region. I plan on voting for Mr. Sherman's bill. I'd like to add one more comment about UNRWA. Despite the issue related to the Palestinian Authority's textbooks, we are discussing at this moment thousands of UNRWA employees, many of whom have years-long relationship with the United States, that remain in Gaza doing incredibly dangerous humanitarian work, and we must keep them in mind as this conflict unfolds. And I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield? Yes.
Wait.
It is not in the interest of Israel, not in the interest of America, for us to embrace the lie of Hamas that they are the official representative of the Palestinian people, or that Palestinians, or that they are representative of the vast majority. Now, I don't know what percentage of Palestinians would vote for Hamas. No one knows. And we don't know what would happen if there was a fair election where speaking against Hamas didn't get you killed. But we do know one thing, and that is the goal of Israel is to destroy Hamas. The goal of Israel is not to destroy the Palestinian people. And if we take the position that they are one and the same, we play into Hamas's propaganda, and we create a circumstance in which Israel cannot achieve its objectives. So that is a separate debate. This is because, to the extent Hamas has any support, it is precisely because of an educational system that is so awful. And so taking a step toward improving that education system is an important step. This bill should not be controversial. It should not be where we debate whether Hamas has 10% or 90% or 3% or 42% of popular support, nor does it make any sense to evaluate the popular support anything has in an atmosphere where there's not free speech and democracy. God knows Putin has a lot of support in Russia because you can't find out anything about, you can't get information on the other side. So I think that we have to drive a wedge between Hamas and the Palestinian people. I think we need to pass this bill, and I don't think we need to say that all Palestinians are responsible for what Hamas has done. Keep in mind that Palestinians live in 3 areas, or many areas, but 3 that are there in the area nominally controlled by Israel. Those who are Palestinian Israelis have, as one of their chief leaders came forward and said now is the time to be calm, and expressed just terrible pain at those who had been killed. We have Palestinians on the West Bank who have had more freedom than those in Gaza, and their support for Hamas seems to be considerably less. And then you have those Palestinians who have lived under the thumb of Hamas, who has controlled the information, unfortunately controlled the textbooks. Let's pass this bill, and let's take one step toward letting the Palestinian people have honest information. And if we want to debate the degree to which Hamas has support among Palestinians, let's do it some other day. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does any member want recognition? Mr. Lawler?
Yes, Madam Chair, I yield my time to Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Lawler. I could ask for my colleagues' words to be taken down, but I won't, because I believe in free speech, and I believe in your right to speak. I also believe that I am worthy to speak. I believe that I'm worthy to speak simply because I'm an American, and I offered to present thoughtful information that has been brought forward literally in this committee. As I mentioned, and I'll say it again, it's been brought forward by Republicans and Democrats, Republican witnesses and Democrat witnesses, not just in 2023, but 22 and 21 and 2018, 19, you name the year. It's continually brought forward that they would win popular election, that they are the popular group. We don't separate Gaza and the West Bank in terms of government. That's a different conversation that should perhaps be had. But it's continually said by entity after entity after entity. And the equivalency that's being made here would be like trying to separate the bulk of the German population from those that were Nazis in World War II. The argument that, you want to ask me if I was if I'm a member of the Ku Klux Klan because I'm white? Well, I'm half white, I'm half Mexican. I know there's a lot of identity politics that gets played here. But no, of course I'm not. I'm not a part of that hate organization, which I would absolutely despise. But let's recall that they're not our government. They're not. And there's instance after instance after instance of the vast majority of our population that stood up against such hatred, thank God. And look, if you want to have another argument about the history of the Democratic Party, we could do that in length. But I suspect you don't, because you would lose the factual argument on that one as well, because I will bring facts. I will bring facts.
Let's bring facts.
Yeah, let's talk about look, I don't want to bastardize Mr. Sherman's bill because it's good policy, but we could talk about the stance of your party, the fugitive slave laws, the history of amendments for people to vote over and over. I mean, we could have another debate on that another day. I'm not going to bastardize Mr. Sherman's amendment for the purpose of your party. Okay. But the fact is, I brought facts about exactly what the Palestinian people have been doing. The fact that they weren't standing up against taking these hostages, are not turning over these hostages as we speak. That's just simply not what's happening. Mr. Lawler, I thank you for the time.
Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion?
I'll make this quick, Madam Chair, but
Mr.
I
Phillips
just...
is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a fierce defender of Israel. I have great affection for its people. I despise Hamas, I think like every one of us in this room. But above all, I have affection for humanity, and I think like every one of you in this room, no matter your politics, do. And Mr. Mast, you know my affection and appreciation of you and your service and sacrifices to this country. I just want to make it clear, as a defender of Israel, that I've spoken with a lot of Palestinians because I want to learn about the very question we're talking about right now. You know, does Hamas represent you? Truth is, the last election was in the early 2000s. An overwhelming majority of Gazans have never had the chance to actually vote for those who represent them. And I just need to say this publicly. I think it is analogous to saying that all Americans are Democrats or all Americans are Republicans. That's not the case. And I just think as we have these discussions that we will be collectively more effective if we recognize that we might be able to play a role in legitimate Palestinian self-determination with a legitimately democratically elected government with legitimate rights and freedoms and protections and safety and security and prosperity. And I would just ask that we perhaps consider that, because it is my belief as a man of the Jewish faith, as a supporter of Israel, that we all have a responsibility to care about the Palestinian suffering. The same kids, just like little Abigail here, who's being held hostage in Gaza, there are many like her who have nothing to do with this, who are losing their lives, and I just think we need that equal dose of compassion. I just want to say thank you. This is the kind of discussion that I hope we can turn chicken crap into chicken salad. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Mr. Moskowitz, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make one point, and you all have heard how I feel on this subject, but I don't believe that everyone in Gaza is Hamas, and I don't believe that every Palestinian is Hamas. But I will make one analogous point. If you go to any Holocaust museum, you will learn about all of the Germans that hid Jews in their attic, saved Jews. There are gardens built to these people who stood up during that time. I look forward to hearing the stories out of Gaza for the people who did that, for the Jewish people who were held hostage. With that, I will yield the balance of my time to Ranking Member Meeks.
Great.
Yeah. I just want to say this.
Mr. Meeks, you're recognized. Okay.
You know, being raised, and I thank Mr. Phillips for his comments, Mr. Sherman, but it becomes really personal to me. I can recall in my community, because it's personal, when African Americans were being brutalized in the South, in the North, didn't have the right to vote, was whipped, was hung. You say the Ku Klux Klan wasn't the government. Many of them were elected. They were senators. They were members of the House. They were judges. So they were part of the government. And I would urge in my community people who would grow up and say, I hate white people, because their vision was they were all the same. And I fought to say you can't hate all white people. You can't say they're all the same. Many of them did not come to my aid, or to my parents' aid, or to my grandparents' aid. I've lived it. It would have been easy to say all white people were bad. And many of my folks wanted to do that. Dr. King died. He walked arm in arm with Jewish people to make so that we would all have a better life. There was people that was against Dr. King because he said, I don't hate. I don't put them all in the same category. You can't put human beings all in the same category. And that's what really got me upset here, because what I saw was you're putting human beings all in the same category and saying that there is no difference between the two. I've fought against that all of my life. And I'm going to fight for that because we're all human beings. And we're not all the same. There's good and there's bad. Hamas is bad. And I can't stand for just broadly saying everybody, because of one nationality or who they are, that they're all the same. That never brings us to any peace. I'm looking for the day when we can say, and what I love about America and moving forward is that it is allowing people through all the problems we're moving toward, and I was seeking to be a more perfect nation so that everybody can live collectively and not classified as this or that, but as humans. And what I feel about Hamas is the way I felt about the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan didn't look at African Americans as humans. Hamas doesn't look at Jews as humans. And that has got to stop. And we can only do it collectively when we recognize that there are good and bad. Let's go after the bad. But let's try to help the good. Because in the end, if we do that, this place will be a better place. And so I cannot tolerate, and that just upsets me, when we try to put everybody in one circle. It should not happen that way. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you for that discussion.
I would ask
Madam Chair?
The opportunity to speak for 2 minutes, or I know Mr. Keating hasn't spoken.
Mr. Keating, would you like to speak?
Yeah, Madam Chairman,
okay, you are now recognized.
Perhaps this is a good time. I sat here and thought back at the early lessons of my life, and I had a grandmother and grandfather who came from Ireland. They worked hard. They brought up 8 children. One of them saved a gentleman's life when he was carrying lead and lost his life. He was machine gunned to death doing that. They've given a lot to this country. And when they were wanted and saved and scrimped, my grandmother was a house servant. My grandfather worked in local farms. And they saved and they scrimped and they wanted to buy a house. And when it was heard that Irish Catholics wanted to purchase a house in the neighborhood back then, people in that neighborhood, Yankee people and people with prejudice, called an emergency meeting in the neighborhood. They said, we have to gather together. We can't let these Irish Catholics buy a house in our neighborhood and own a home. My grandmother told me this story about the meeting. They weren't successful. But a few years later, right down the street, a 2-minute walk, they wanted to purchase some land to build a temple in that neighborhood, a synagogue in that neighborhood. And the same woman went around to the neighborhood with the alarm and said, we have to have a neighborhood meeting so that Jewish people can't have this synagogue in our neighborhood. It'll destroy our neighborhood. And at that time, my grandmother even took the town meeting floor to speak in favor of having a temple in that neighborhood, particularly when the same woman called her up and said, we have an emergency meeting. We need you there. They want to build a Jewish temple in the neighborhood. And my grandmother with a brogue said, well, this wouldn't be the same type of meeting you had about me, would it? And she told me this lesson as a young child. And she told me because she wanted me to know that discrimination against one is discrimination against all. An important lesson that we should remember today. Because Palestinians are being lumped into a category where a terrorist group is there. And you know, when we do this and have this discussion, we're playing right into their hands. We're playing into the hands of Hamas, who have other kind of weapons, other than what we saw just a short time ago in Israel. They have weapons of hate. They want to create violence and turmoil. And they want to stir those up and weaponize those things too. So I think we should realize that be careful how we categorize things, especially in this position here, where the world will be watching and listening, because we can't play into their hands. They have to be defeated at every level, and that includes making sure that we're not engaging in rhetoric that is divisive, unfair, and discriminatory. I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman, yes.
It is wrong, first of all, as to the righteous who protected Jews from the Nazis. They had the opportunity to do so. There are 200, 250 Jews in Gaza. There's no opportunity for a Schindler to hire them or for a Dutch family to shelter them. But there are Palestinians who are helping Mossad, helping Israeli intelligence as we speak. And that is the only practical way. And I would not be surprised if there are Palestinians who identify the location of some of the hostages. So equating Hamas with the Palestinians is wrong for several reasons. First, it's not true. But second, even if it were true, and it is true to some extent, obviously Hamas has some support, it is extremely harmful to Israel to equate the two. Israel may be able to deal with 30,000 Hamas fighters. Israel would prefer not to deal with 2 million people and identify each one of them as an implacable enemy. The fact is that if this operation goes as it should, there are people who will have leaned in the direction of Hamas when Hamas is in power and will lead in another direction, especially when we all hope that the Gaza has better governance a year or two from now. So there may be some people who kind of root for Hamas today and will turn their backs on them tomorrow. But for God's sakes, please vote for the bill. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Thank you.
I'm with you on that.
All right. There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. So does any member wish to offer an amendment? Okay. There being no amendments, I move that the committee report H.R. 3266 to the House with a favorable recommendation.
I would like a recorded vote.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed signify saying
Madam
no.
Chair, I'm requesting a recorded vote.
Yes, in my opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. You still want recorded vote?
Yes,
It's agreed
as I indicated,
Okay.
the people in your
Sure.
party have give a committee more credibility if it has a recorded
Good.
vote on the bill.
A
So
roll
that's why I
call
want a
vote
recorded
has
vote.
been requested, and pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed.
Thank you.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3774, the SHIP Act. The bill was circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 3774, to impose additional sanctions with respect to the importation and facilitation of the importation of petroleum products from Iran and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, the Lawler Amendment in the nature of a substitute number 91 circulated to members in advance shall be considered as read and will be treated as original text for purposes of amendment. Is there any discussion on the bill? Mr. Lawler, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the wake of the reprehensible terrorist attacks against our closest ally, Israel, on October 7th, it's paramount that we work to break down the dark web of connections that enable such violence. We've stood by Israel in its darkest hours, and today we reiterate that support, ensuring the safety and security of the Israeli people from these threats. A primary source of the threats against Israel comes from the funding that these terror groups receive from Iran. which is why it is so critical that we kneecap Iran's ability to provide this support. The Stop Harboring Iranian Petroleum Act, otherwise known as the SHIP Act, which I introduced earlier this year with my House Foreign Affairs Committee colleague, Jared Moskowitz of Florida, does just that by going after one of its primary funding sources, the Iranian oil trade. The U.S. has rightly sanctioned Iranian oil, a common-sense measure in the fight to prevent Iran from acquiring additional capital with which to fund terrorism. However, it's disheartening to see other nations do not share this commitment. In August of this year alone, China imported a staggering 1.5 million barrels per day of Iranian oil. China is sending a clear message to the rest of the world by supporting the Iranian regime. In doing so, China and other importers of Iranian oil have become complicit in the nefarious acts carried out with that funding. The SHIP Act, which we are marking up here today, currently has over 200 bipartisan co-sponsors. The support is a testament to Congress's united resolve against Iran and against its enablers. The SHIP Act specifically mandates that the President impose sanctions on entities that knowingly process illicit Iranian oil, from individuals operating ports that accept vessels transporting Iranian oil to those refining this oil. Every enabler in this supply chain must face consequences. The bill also clearly states that these sanctions are not a permanent feature. They can be terminated if Iran stops supporting international terrorism and halts the development of biological and chemical weapons and missiles. Yet beyond the provisions of the SHIP Act, there's a larger message here, a message about the kind of world we want to live in, a world where nations collaborate to thwart terrorism, one where allies stand up against any entity that compromises global peace and prosperity. Israel's pain is a somber reminder of the consequences of complacency. We must ensure that Iran has no money with which to fund extremist groups that destabilize the Middle East and the world. We need to send a clear message that countries, that they must reconsider their priorities and not allow the weight of their transactions to indirectly shed innocent blood. We as the United States possess the power and the moral obligation to shape the global order. The SHIP Act is more than just a piece of legislation. It's our commitment to a safer, more peaceful world. It's our pledge to Israel and every nation that the United States values above all else peace, security, and freedom. Let us work together to get this bill passed to ensure peace, safety, and security in the Middle East, especially for our ally Israel. I look forward to engaging in discussion today about the merits of the bill and why it is so critical that the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the United States Congress is united in opposition to Iran and its enablers. I have here amendments in the nature of a substitute to make a few changes to this bipartisan bill, largely technical corrections, and other additions to ensure there are no unintended consequences of the bill. The goal here is to impose sanctions on Iran and its enablers and cut off their funding that they have used to massacre the Jewish people. That's exactly what this bill and this ANS is targeted to do. At a time like this, we cannot be passive. We must take action. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Castro for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I speak in opposition to H.R. 3774, which I believe would undermine our national security, harm our allies, and hurt our economy. This bill is based on a flawed premise that we know all too well by now, that more sanctions on Iran will coerce their leaders to engage in good faith negotiations with the United States. The reality is that this bill would do the opposite of what it intends to do. It would isolate the United States, alienate our partners, and empower Iran's hardliners. This bill would sanction any ships, shipping company, or port that handles Iranian oil. This would have devastating effects on the global economy and on oil prices. If this bill were enacted, U.S. companies would be prohibited from doing any business, including transferring goods, at many of the world's biggest ports, including in some of our largest allies and economic partners. This bill would disrupt global trade, supply chains, and damage our relations with important allies and partners. Not only would this bill cause a wholesale disruption of the global economy, but it would also raise gas prices and consumer prices here at home. This bill would also have a devastating effect on our constituents domestically by raising those gas and consumer prices. If this broad, sweeping bill were enacted, Americans would feel the pain at the gas pump and the grocery store. This is irresponsible legislation, I believe. Mr. Chairman, or Madam Chairwoman, I've been a consistent supporter for diplomacy, dialogue, and even sensible sanctions when it comes to Iran. I've also been a vocal critic of Iran's human rights abuses, its support for terrorism, and its destabilizing activities in the region. I believe that we need to hold Iran accountable for its actions, but we also need to pursue a realistic and pragmatic approach that advances our interests and values. For that reason, I oppose the bill as drafted and urge my colleagues to also oppose this measure. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. I now would like to recognize myself to say a few words about this bill. And I speak in strong support of Representative Lawler's Stop Harboring Iranian Petroleum Act, which I am a co-sponsor. This bipartisan legislation will close a loophole in our sanctions policy that allows Iran to move oil through refineries and ports that are not directly sanctioned. Iran exploits this loophole and uses the revenue it earns from oil sales to continue financing terrorism abroad, including Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Iran has provided Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad with tens of millions of dollars, and these groups, in turn, used this funding to build the rockets that are falling on Israel as we speak. Iran also provides Hezbollah with the most of its funding, training weapons, and explosives. In the aftermath of Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel, and as Hezbollah continues escalating on Israel's northern border, it is critical that we take all actions necessary to ensure that the Iranian regime cannot continue exploiting loopholes in our sanctions policy to fund Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah's horrific activities in the Middle East. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield the balance of my time. Now I would like to recognize Ranking Member Meeks.
I share the same goal as the sponsors of this legislation, and that is to prevent Iran from profiting off its petroleum reserves. The tyrannical Iranian regime uses these profits to fund its terrorism and proxy activities, as well as to make advancements in its nuclear program. In fact, it was strict, targeted, multilateral sanctions applied on Iranian petroleum and banking that drove Iran to the table to negotiate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, resulting in a verifiable agreement that cut off every pathway to an Iranian nuclear weapon. The bill before us today aims to apply unilateral mandatory sanctions on anyone who does any of the following with Iranian oil: operate a port that accepts or transfers the oil, operate a refinery that processes Iranian oil, runs a business that purchases, sells, or finances Iranian oil, ships Iranian oil, or knowingly works at any facility that handles Iranian oil. Without a doubt, the target of these sanctions is China, the largest purchaser of Iranian oil. If China stopped buying oil from Iran, Iran would be starved of the funds it uses to destabilize its region and the world. But this is not something we can achieve overnight without causing ripples in the global economy. In today's interconnected world, where China is a major player and trading partner of the United States, we cannot be expected to be shielded from economic impacts at home. We must acknowledge that the scope of these proposed sanctions is massive. Without a doubt, if fully implemented, there will be sufficient chaos in the global energy markets, commercial shipping, and port operations when we go after China's oil purchases in this matter. Gas prices in our own country would certainly rise, and the middle-class families would be immediately impacted. Shipping from Asia to the United States could be stalled, denying American goods they require. Again, the scope of this bill is massive. Throughout my career in Congress, I have viewed sanctions as a diplomatic tool and not necessarily as an end on their own. The Foreign Affairs Committee is the committee of diplomacy, and sanctions are one of the most important and impactful tools that we have in managing our relationships and security around the globe. Sanctions have to be limber. The executive branch that administers them needs to be able to adjust and scale them up and down as needed to make them successful. Unfortunately, the waiver within this bill provides the executive with very limited flexibility. It is one of the strictest standards that can be found in law. In other words, the waiver provision is nearly unusable, and I think this standard must be adjusted to make this bill workable. Another problem is that it is an extreme tool we don't even know will work. During the height of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, sanctions were levied against a major Chinese shipping company, Costco, that at times had moved shipments of Iranian oil. The Trump administration had to pull these sanctions off the books after only a few months because they quickly learned the impact of global energy and logistics markets was far too damaging. And that was just one company. The scope of this legislation is much, much larger. Finally, the difference between this proposal and the petroleum sanctions of the pre-JCPOA era is that this effort is unilateral, whereas previous sanctions were done in a multilateral manner. We did the hard work of uniting the world behind the policy before implementation of the sanctions. Here, we'll be going at it alone. And we must keep in mind that taking this oil immediately off the market in this manner will be a direct benefit to Russia, who will profit from higher oil prices and increased demand. The infusion of cash for Putin would be a body blow to our Ukrainian friends. And I want to be able to support this bill, but it is not ready for prime time. But I must thank Chairman McCaul and his staff, who's worked hard, his staff, for making some meaningful changes to the original bill leading up to this markup. The unprecedented sanctions have been removed that quite literally would have sanctioned the entire world. There's a new safe harbor for companies that take significant and verifiable steps towards permanently terminating Iranian oil dealings, and there are better protections for family members that have nothing to do with their family members' crimes.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I recognize myself now for 5 minutes in support of Representative Lawler's legislation to stop harboring Iranian Petroleum Act of 2023. This is a crucial piece of legislation that seeks to impose targeted sanctions on foreign persons and entities engaging in activities that undermine international efforts to curb Iran's illicit trade in petroleum and petrochemicals. I want to address the ranking member's concerns and the gentleman from Texas's concerns in a minute, but let me just first tell you why I support Mr. Lawler's bill. As a member of both the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the National Security Subcommittee, the House Financial Services Committee, with oversight over the Treasury Department's implementation and enforcement of sanctions, I firmly believe that this bill is a vital step in stopping a key source of illegal funding to Iran and cutting off the mullah's cash cow to fund their ongoing terrorist activities in support of Hamas's brazen and illegal war against Israeli citizens. The measures outlined in this legislation specifically target foreign persons or entities that knowingly facilitate the transport of Iranian crude oil, engage in transactions involving petroleum products from Iran, operate vessels from ship-to-ship transfers of these products, or own and operate refineries processing Iranian petroleum products. In addition, the bill addresses those who are associated with these entities and those who attempt to hide their assets. The significance of these sanctions: 1, it curbs Iranian oil trade. 2, it disrupts the petrochemical trade. 3, it prevents ship-to-ship transfers. 4, it hinders refining activities. And 5, it holds associated individuals accountable. And finally, blocked or owned control entities by imposing sanctions on entities owned or controlled by these entities engaged in these activities, we cut off the avenues for evasion and deter foreign actors from participating in such conduct. In light of Iran's support for the unprovoked attack against Israel by Hamas, it is essential for us to stand together united in our commitment to cut off all financing to Iran's war machine. And I would note, significant bipartisan support for Mr. Lawler's bill, notwithstanding the opposition voiced by the gentleman from Texas and the ranking member's reservations. The bill before us is not just a message to Iran, but to the entire world that we are unwavering in our resolve to combat illicit activities that threaten global stability. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. Now let me turn to some of the objections offered by my colleague from Texas and then the ranking member. Why? Why are my colleagues so determined to be soft on Iran after what we have witnessed over the last several days? Why? Why are we chasing sanctions relief? Why are we afraid to punish the very perpetrators of this act against humanity? Why are we so appeasing to terrorists? This is a moment to stand side by side with our allies in Israel, not to go soft on the very sponsors and enablers of these heinous crimes against humanity. Why would we accommodate and help the financing of this outrageous war? My friends talk about the impact on global energy markets. They talk about pain at the gas pump. Well, then why on earth are my colleagues who are worried about pain at the gas pump declaring war on American energy production? Why do they vote against H.R. 1? If you're worried about rewarding Putin, my goodness, vote for more energy production here at home. Oppose this crazy idea of politicizing financial flows to American companies through ESG. Stop blocking the Keystone XL pipeline. Stop blocking licenses for oil and gas producers in the United States. If you want to lower the price at the pump and be able to have the geopolitical tools to punish Iran without hurting our allies or the United States, then you can chew gum and walk at the same time. You can impose tough sanctions on the financing of this war and cripple the Iranian oil industry and those who help it, while at the same time increasing production to the rest of the world. This is why the Democrats' war on American energy has geopolitical ramifications. It ties our hands and disables our ability to use the tools of foreign policy available to us, our sanctions. So, what I would say, if you're concerned about global energy prices, if you're concerned about Americans feeling pain at the pump, then support Mr. Lawler's bill and support American energy production at the same time. What planet are we living on when you express concern about pain at the pump and wanting to go easy on Iran's oil industry, which, by the way, has emissions much higher than American oil production, but you want to punish and discriminate against American energy production? It makes absolutely zero sense. I guess climate change only applies to American energy, but it doesn't apply to Iranian energy. Let's get real, people. Get tough on Iran, block the financing, and if you're worried about the impact on global energy markets, my gosh, vote for Republicans' bill to increase energy production in the United States, both to lower the price of the pump for Americans, but also to give us the geopolitical tools that we can use and not reward Putin and not reward the mullahs in Tehran. With that, I yield. Is there any further discussion on the gentleman's bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Mr. Castro.
Thank you. I have a Castro amendment number 1.
The clerk shall distribute the amendment. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3774, offered by Mr. Castro of Texas. Page 2, line 10, insert the subsection G after subsection E2. Page 9, after...
Without objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you. I offer this amendment because my concerns that the sanctions described in this bill would significantly raise the price of gas back home in my hometown of San Antonio and all of our hometowns. The primary and secondary sanctions in this bill are sweeping and extensive, and there's a reason they've never been done before. They target our adversaries and our allies in Europe, in Asia, and around the world. My amendment is straightforward. Before the sanctions in the bill are implemented, it requires the U.S. Government Accountability Office to conduct a study on the effect of the bill's sanctions on the price of gas. The sanctions in the bill would be able to be implemented if that review finds that the sanctions would not raise the price of gas in the United States, and the President certifies a concurrence with that report. As I am sure my colleagues can agree, the price of gas is higher every day, and our constituents face the pain. Rising gas prices means families have to make difficult decisions between the fuel needed to drive to work and the food to put on their table, medicines they need to pay for, rent they need to pay for, and so forth. If we adopt this amendment, we ensure that our efforts do not harm our constituents when the sanctions go into effect. Passing this legislation without this amendment is effectively voting to raise the price of gas for American families. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I oppose the gentleman's amendment. I oppose it because it sends precisely the wrong message to the world and proceeds on a false assumption that the ability of the Iranian regime to sell oil somehow results in lower domestic gasoline prices. It does not. First, nothing is worse for global oil prices than an enriched and emboldened Iranian regime that seeks to spread terror and instability throughout the Middle East. Second, American refineries are not configured to use Iranian oil, but Chinese refineries are. More Iranian oil means cheaper fuel for China, not lower gasoline prices for the United States. If we want, as I said before, if we want to get serious about lower gasoline prices in the United States, we need to increase domestic production. My friend, the ranking member, says that production is high. We need more production. We need H.R. 1. We need more production, more domestic production now more than ever because of the situation in the Middle East. We do not need to empower an Iranian regime that supports terrorist groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Again, it is fascinating to me, the hypocrisy of the very members of Congress who are so alarmed at climate change, so alarmed at elevated global emissions. But when it comes to Iranian oil, more is better. Fossil energy from Iran, good. Fossil energy from the United States, bad. Come on, let's get serious. We need to punish Iran and the sources of financing Hamas now, immediately, yesterday, and we need to cut off the financing for this horrific terrorist attack against our key ally. And if you're worried about global energy markets, my goodness, stop your war on domestic American energy. I yield. Do any other members seek recognition? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you. And I will say we do produce more oil today than ever. We also sanction. We don't take in any or purchase any Iranian oil in the United States of America. So the reason why I support Mr. Castro's amendment, because it requires the Comptroller General of the United States to conduct a study and submit to the appropriate congressional committees a report on the effect these proposed sanctions will have on the price of gasoline in the United States. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the impact on global energy markets following implementation of this policy could be severe. And I believe this reporting will help both Congress and the administration make better policy decisions that I hope will work. And I'm a firm believer that unilateral sanctions generally don't work. It's multilateral sanctions that work. And it's getting the rest of the world working collectively together in regards to having effective sanctions. And with that, I intend on supporting and ask all to support Mr. Castro's amendment.
Does the gentleman yield back?
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition? The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mass, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for recognizing me. I appreciate the gentleman's amendment, and I'll say it's something certainly to think about and consider. I will. And I will simply say, as been pointed out already, that I hope yourself and some others also take the time to apply that same rationale to the Biden administration's policies on domestic oil production and ask that question for yourselves. Will it not raise the price of refined gasoline in the United States of America, as is outlined in Part A, lines 14 and 15 in this? I think it's food for thought for all of us, whether we're talking about domestic policy or foreign policy, but thank you for giving me something to think about.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition? Mr. Phillips from Minnesota, you have 5 minutes.
Not on the, I have an amendment at the desk. Yeah, sorry.
We'll save that for just one moment. Any other members wish to speak on Mr. Castro's amendment? Seeing none, there being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Representative Castro, amendment number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Castro has requested a roll call vote. A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? Mr. Phillips is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk. I'm sorry, number 70? 70. Yeah, number 70.
The clerk shall distribute the amendment. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3774, offered by Mr. Phillips of Minnesota. Page 11, after line 4, insert the following.
Without further objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I share the committee's concern with the proliferation of Iranian oil all around the globe, largely in contravention of existing U.S. sanctions. Revenue from oil sales, primarily to China, provides significant resources that enable the Iranian regime to advance its nuclear program, continue its support for terrorism, and maintain its repression of the Iranian people. As we've seen, especially over these last heartbreaking weeks, Iran continues to support proxy terror all around the region that rains on our ally Israel regularly and continues to demand the destruction of the United States of America. That's why I believe we must use all the tools at our disposal to address the illegal source of Iranian revenue. And when I say that, I mean all. That means carrots and sticks. That's why I put forward an amendment that would require the Secretary of State, in coordination with the Secretary of the Treasury, to submit a diplomatic strategy to also combat Iran's illegal oil exports, as well as asking the administration to determine whether to establish a multilateral working group to address this challenge with our partners and allies all across the globe. Yes, sanctions are an important tool in our toolbox to deter the illicit purchase of Iranian oil, but I also believe that we should include our significant power of diplomacy as well, the power of bringing like-minded partners together to address this challenge collectively. So I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other, I support this amendment, by the way. Do any other members seek recognition? Mr. Meeks is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This amendment requires a diplomatic strategy from the executive to combat Iran's illicit oil exports. Diplomacy, something that I believe in with every inch of my body, should be at the forefront of all of our global engagements. I will vote in support of this amendment. I thank Mr. Phillips for bringing it forward, and I ask all of my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Representative Phillips, amendment number 70. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
And I'd like a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments?
Number
The gentleman
71.
from Minnesota, Mr. Phillips, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I have an amendment at the desk number 71, please.
The clerk shall distribute the amendment. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3774, offered by Mr. Phillips of Minnesota. Page 11, after line 4, insert the following. Section, report before.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll start by associating myself with the remarks of my friend and colleague, Mr. Mast, about fuel prices in the United States, and which is what this amendment is all about. So I want to reiterate my comments about our shared commitment to deterring countries from buying illicit Iranian oil and continuing to counter the Iranian regime's malign activities, whether that be preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, providing drones to Russia for its illegal, grotesque, and unjust invasion of Ukraine, supporting Hamas terrorist attacks, or committing human rights violations against its very own population. I unequivocally stand united with all of my colleagues in these efforts. But I also want to be realistic about the impact of what we do in this committee and how the intended results, no matter how important and reasonable, might not be aligned with actual consequences. And that's why I'm putting forth this amendment that would require a report on the implications of the sanctions authorized by this bill on consumer fuel prices in the United States, on global shipping prices, Russian oil sales and its impact on the illegal war in Ukraine, and finally, on ongoing efforts to stop the flow of illegal opioids from China to the United States. These issues, all of which have direct impacts on the citizens we represent, the American people, need to be fully understood before we move forward with any new sanctions that go beyond the existing comprehensive set that the U.S. already has in place. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I oppose this amendment, amendment number 71 by Mr. Phillips. I oppose this amendment because it sends the wrong message and proceeds on at least two major false assumptions. First, the assumption that Iranian oil somehow results in the lower domestic gasoline prices, and it does not. Second, the assumption that we must choose between constraining Russia or constraining the Iranian regime. We can do both. Russia already sells a lot of oil to China. We do not need to choose between constraining Iran or constraining Russia. We can prevent oil sanctions against Iran from creating a windfall for Russia by adequately enforcing our sanctions targeting Russia, measures like the Russian oil price cap. Do any other members seek recognition? Mr. Meeks, the gentleman from New York, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This amendment requires a report from the President that outlines the impact of this legislation on American consumer fuel prices, global shipping, Russian oil sales, and the impact on its illegal war in Ukraine, and ongoing efforts to stop the flow of illegal opioids from China to the United States. It is a very reasonable and I think important amendment to this bill, and I support this amendment, and I ask my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition? The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
You know, Mr. Chair, I just listened to your remarks. I just want to comment that we all know that the oil market is a global market that is affected by supply and demand, underproduction, overproduction. So indeed, sanctions have an effect on oil prices no matter where the oil might be coming from the ground. And I have appreciation for my Republican colleagues who are looking out for American people who are suffering from inflation. It's a daily case that's made on the House floor and committees all around this, this complex. So I have to confess to some surprise that when it comes to protecting these very American interests and inflationary pressure, that we wouldn't at least ensure that any sanctions that we might apply, even with good intention, would have inflationary effects, because I think American people are suffering, despite a strong economy, with increasing costs. So I think this is an important amendment, and frankly, I'm a little surprised that it wouldn't generate more support on both sides of the aisle. But with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Representative Phillips, amendment number 71. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Oh, gosh, yes, I'd like a roll call vote, please.
A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? Hearing no further amendments, further proceedings on this bill are postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H Resolutions 599, urging the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. The resolution was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the resolution.
HRES 599, urging the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the resolution is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Is there any discussion on the resolution? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier today, I spoke about the Iranian threat. That's what keeps me up at night, every single night, or at least it did. Now I am kept up at night thinking about the more than 1,300 Israelis and Americans massacred on October 7th, about the more than 200 hostages languishing in Gaza as we speak, and about the further death and destruction that lays ahead. My entire life, I've worked towards peace between Israel and the Palestinians and the neighbors in the region. And that's why I'm proud, so proud, to be a co-chair of the Abraham Accords Caucus, along with my colleagues across the aisle and on this committee, Ann Wagner. Seeing countries that had no diplomatic ties with Israel suddenly develop warm bonds between people has felt like a dream. It is that dream of peace that I continue to hope for. What I know is that the threats to that dream are groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and countries like Iran. Hezbollah is an Iranian-backed terrorist organization committed to the destruction of Israel and of peace throughout the region. We saw on October 7th what that ideology can unleash. As the U.S. has done the right thing by recognizing Hezbollah, we're calling on others to do the same. Unfortunately, our good friends in Europe often make a distinction between the organization's political and military wings, seeing the former as a partner they can try to work with. Looking at how Lebanon has been on the verge of becoming a failed state, we cannot underestimate the pernicious role played by Hezbollah. Hezbollah bombed our embassy in Beirut in April 1983, killing 63 people. And in October of the same year, attacked our Marine barracks, killing 241 Americans. This behavior has never stopped, never paused. They murdered Israeli tourists in Bulgaria in 2012, tried to do so again in Cyprus in 2013. 2 years later, they got caught in Cyprus once more with 8 tons of ammonium nitrate. That year, Congress passed the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act of 2015, and I was proud to help lead a follow-up to that bill in 2018. Despite our best efforts to counter it, the resolution describes in detail Hezbollah's nefarious activities in Belgium, France, Germany, and throughout the European Union. I've always said that the world is at its best when America leads. We have seen that in Ukraine. We are seeing that today in Israel. We have led on countering Hezbollah, and we must now urge our European allies to join us in doing the same. As we look at Hezbollah skirmishing with Israel and loudly supporting Hamas, I hope our European partners will take this moment as a wake-up call. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization and must be designated as such in its entirety. I urge my colleagues to join in this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Would any other member like to be recognized? The gentlelady is I'm sorry. Mr. Meeks, the ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank my friend Brad Schneider for continuing to advance this important legislation first introduced by our former colleague, Ted Deutsch. More than a decade ago, following Hezbollah's 2012 bus bombing in Burgas, Bulgaria, the European Union added the group's military wing to its terror list, leaving it supposedly separate political arm unsanctioned. Despite all we know about Hezbollah, a cutthroat terrorist organization that serves as an Iranian proxy and violent militia, our friends and partners in the European Union to this day only include Hezbollah's military wing and not its political wing, and on its list of sanctioned terrorist organizations. The Secretary of State's designation of Hezbollah makes no distinction between its branches, and we would urge the EU to simply make no distinction and add the group to its entirety to the terror list. And all members should reject the view of former President Trump, the leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination, who last week offered Hezbollah's praise and declared, "You know Hezbollah is very smart. They're all very smart." Smart is not how I would describe Hezbollah. I would describe them as terrorists. And I'm pleased that many individual European countries have acted, as has the Arab League and the Gulf Cooperation Council. And I'm certain my colleagues join me in this view. But it is very troubling to me that the EU, an entity that shares our values and many of our policy goals, continues to allow Hezbollah's political wing to freely operate, advancing Hezbollah's violent agenda around the world. Let's hope that Europe hears the voice of this Congress loudly and clearly and finally takes the necessary step to designate Hezbollah as a whole. It is long overdue and would be a very welcome development as Hezbollah continues to threaten Israel and the United States from its perch in southern Lebanon. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition? The gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Manning, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am proud to support HRES 599, a bipartisan resolution that I was proud to help introduce with Congressman Brad Schneider and colleagues on both sides of the aisle, urging the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. The terrorist group Hezbollah is a linchpin of Iran's axis of resistance and is responsible for thousands of civilian deaths in the Middle East and around the globe, including the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Beirut and the 1994 Amia Jewish Community Center bombing in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Until 9/11, Hezbollah had killed more Americans than any other terrorist group, and today it maintains an arsenal of 150,000 rockets aimed at Israel. In recent days, Hezbollah has fired upon Israel, threatening to open up a second front in the war along Israel's northern border, risking a wider regional confrontation and putting civilians in Lebanon at risk. Given these facts, it is incomprehensible that any EU member state can credibly assert any distinction between Hezbollah's so-called military and political wings. The truth is, there is one unified Hezbollah, and it is dedicated to carrying out terrorist activities around the world. That's why this bipartisan resolution calls on our partners in the EU to take a stronger stand against worldwide terrorism by designating Hezbollah as a whole as a terrorist organization. Earlier this year, I was also proud to help lead a bipartisan effort with Congressman Tom Keene, Bill Keating, and more than 130 of our colleagues urging the EU to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. We must continue to keep pressure on Hezbollah, the IRGC, and all other terrorist groups that threaten the United States and our ally Israel, that undermine peace, security, and stability throughout the region and around the world. Mr. Chairman, I urge support for this bipartisan measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Do any other members seek recognition to speak on House Resolution 599? There being no further discussion of the resolution, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Do any members wish to offer any amendments? There being no amendments, I move that the committee report for House Resolution 599 that the committee report House Resolution 599 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, because evidently it's necessary to get consideration, I ask for the yeas and nays.
A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote has been or will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up House Resolution 1809, block the use of transatlantic technology in Iranian-made drones act. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1809, to require the development of strategies and options to prevent the export to Iran of certain technologies related to unmanned aircraft systems and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, the Keating Amendment in the nature of a substitute, number 65, circulated to members in advance, shall be considered as read and will be treated as original text for purposes of amendment. Is there any discussion of the bill?
Chairman.
I recognize Mr. Keating for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks for holding the markup today. 12 days ago, the world witnessed the horror unleashed by Hamas against the state and the people of Israel, almost 50 years to the day after Yom Kippur War. Israel now finds itself threatened and under attack, this time by terrorists whose very charter is an anti-Semitic attack against the Jewish people. I want to be clear. The United States stands behind Israel in the face of these barbaric attacks and condemns Hamas in the harshest possible terms, which we know in no way furthers the cause or represents the Palestinians' right of self-determination. In fact, it sets it back. I also want to acknowledge that the attack on October 7th is not a distant tragedy, but rather a deeply personal one for those of us who have been impacted in many ways right here in this room, in our many districts, the people that live there that are touched by this, and many around the world. As President Biden said, there are moments in this life when the pure, unadulterated evil is unleashed in this world. Israelis and the Jewish people suffered one of those moments last week, and it's important we act today in this committee and in the future to ensure Israel has the resources it needs to defend itself. Today I want to speak briefly in support of H.R. 1809, block the use of transatlantic technology in Iranian-made drones act, which I've offered as an amendment in the nature of a substitute. As we face multiple crises in Israel and in Ukraine, Iran's global malign influence campaign is only growing. For example, we know Iran has been selling unmanned aircraft systems to Russia, which have been used in the illegal war in Ukraine. The White House even released findings that Iran is providing Russia with materials to build a drone manufacturing plant east of Moscow. At the same time, reports have indicated that Hamas, in its devastating attack against Israel, used drones to disable Israeli communications and surveillance capabilities. We also know that Iran has supported Hamas for decades. To target Iran's drones program, H.R. 1809 requires the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and all of government approach to each draft strategies and report to Congress on actions they've taken to prevent the export of U.S. and European technology to Iran that may be used in drones to attack our allies in Ukraine and Israel. In particular, this bill ensures the subcomponents that are key to the functioning of unmanned aircraft systems like microcontrollers, GPS modules, and microprocessors are not used in any way in any aspect of design, developmental, production, or operational, so that they cannot be employed in unmanned aircraft systems. The legislation also includes provisions to ensure the Secretary of State is working with allies and partners to synchronize our support on an export control that's necessary to close the loopholes related to the illegal export of U.S. and European technology for use in Iranian drones. I want to thank Chairman Joe Wilson, Ranking Member Dean Phillips, and Representative Claudia Tenney for being original co-sponsors of this legislation, and other bipartisan members who have also co-sponsored this bill. I also want to thank committee leadership for coming together on a bipartisan agreement on this text. Finally, I want to commend the Biden administration, who's working tirelessly on this issue and who have kept Congress informed of their efforts. Just yesterday, restrictions in the UN Security Council in Resolution 2231 constrained Iran's ballistic missile program, which had expired. In response, the Biden administration imposed a series of additional sanctions, and Secretary Blinken released a statement with 46 other countries recognizing the continued threat posed by the proliferation of missile-related materials, goods, and technology, including those related to unmanned aerial vehicles, and the threat that that Iran poses on this. The U.S. and many allies and partners are united in recognition of the threat posed by the Iranian regime, and our multilateral efforts at the State Department are complemented by the passage of this legislation here today in this committee. I firmly believe this legislation furthers U.S. policy towards our allies in Ukraine and Israel, improves our export controls, and punishes Iran for its malign influence campaigns. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition? The ranking member from New York, Mr. Meeks, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I really appreciate Representative Keating for bringing this bill aiming to counter Iran's procurement and production of armed drones. Over the course of several years, Iran has produced advanced microelectronics, guidance systems, and other technologies necessary to domestically produced drones. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Iran exported significant quantities of these drones to the Russian military. Iranian-origin drones have been used to bombard Ukrainian infrastructure, including residential neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, and daycares. These attacks mirror similar ones conducted by Hamas terrorists, which we understand are conducted by the drones Hamas procured from or manufactured with the assistance of Iran. These drones are instrumental to Hamas's onslaught on southern Israel, which resulted in the murder of scores of Israeli civilians earlier this month. In recent months, we've been made aware of the analysis by our own intelligence community, as well as outside experts and investigators, that found recovered Iranian drones to contain components originating from the United States and European companies. Many Iranian entities are already sanctioned for acquisition of components for and production of drones, as well as their intermediaries, but given the dual use and off-the-shelf availability and commercial nature of some items, regulation and interdiction is difficult. This bill requires strategies from the state and commerce departments on how they intend to prevent such proliferation from continuing. It also requires the Department of State to develop a related strategy to address proliferation of dual-use technology, working within foreign governments to prevent the export and proliferation to Iran. So again, I thank Mr. Keating and all of the co-sponsors, but Mr. Keating in particular for his leadership on this bill, and I urge all members to support it. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The ranking member yields back. Do any other members seek recognition? The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank Mr. Keating for introducing this important measure, along with Mr. Wilson, Ms. Tenney, and me. I'm also proud to co-lead this critical piece of legislation that seeks to prevent the use of American technology in Iranian drones, from its support of Russia's brutal war in Ukraine to proxy militia attacks on U.S. personnel in Syria and Iraq. Iran's development and deployment of drones is a threat to the United States and to our partners. The fact that U.S. materials are being used in Iranian drones that attack American and partner forces and kill Ukrainian civilians is completely unacceptable. And I'm pleased that the Biden administration is undergoing an important review of current policies and practices to ensure that American technology does not find its way into the hands of our adversaries. And I look forward to engaging with them further in its efforts to prevent the proliferation of Iranian drones. I also want to acknowledge that in July of this year, this committee marked up the bipartisan Fight Crime Act, which imposes sanctions on those involved in the supply, sale, transfer, or support of Iran's missile and drone program. Unfortunately, UN restrictions to constrain Iran's ballistic missile program expired just yesterday. During this time of tragedy and uncertainty, the U.S. and our partners must continue to counter Iran's destabilizing missile and drone activity, including by enforcing existing sanctions and passing the Fight Crime Act. Congress must act soon, and that also means we need to elect a speaker so that we can use all the tools at our disposal to prevent the proliferation of Iranian missiles and drones to protect Americans both at home and abroad. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other members seek recognition on this matter? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Do any members wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, I move that the committee report House Resolution 1809 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I request a roll call vote.
A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. The committee will now stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair.